The question is, what is the antidote to corrupt politicians? And I'm sure you, wherever you are, and where I am, we are having to deal with the challenge of corruption in politics, corrupting of the governance of our countries, corruption of the governance of our mutual affairs. And it becomes a big question. And here in the Qur'an, chapter 5, from verse 48 onwards, it actually addresses the issue. And I think we should all pay attention and try to draw the lessons from these few verses. And they amount to about 3 verses, I think 48, 49, and 50. And very, very, very powerful verses. Verses that, without any doubt and without any ambiguity, spells out the nature of just and equitable and good governance. And so let us turn to those verses and go with me through those verses. And I will read through them, and then we will look at a summary of the lessons that we can draw from these verses. So we will try and draw a set of principles that allow for good governance from these verses. And so I will proceed to verse 48, where it says, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ. Let me just quickly go through the English with you. Now then, we revealed afresh unto you the true code as a means of correcting what remains of the erstwhile code, and finally making it immutable. Now that's a mouthful, but if you read carefully through those words, what it is saying is that with the advent of the Qur'an, the revelation, which is speaking about the present tense to the Prophet, the recipient of the text of the Testament, it says to the recipient, this now is again a correction of the previous codes. Musaddiqan lima. And musaddiqan means as a control, as a correction, as a means of verifying the previous codes. Lima bayna yaday, of the erstwhile code. Now we know the previous code preceding the Quran was the Torah, it was the Gospel. And what is added here is that now, however, the difference between this code and previous code is that it has now become immutable, unalterable, unchangeable, uncorruptible, the text of the code. So, musaddiqan lima bay wa muhaiminan alayhi. It means muhaiminan alayhi. It is being rendered immutable. So there's no new code now. This code is frozen. It is preserved, the actual text. I'm not saying the application of the text or the reading of the text or the interpretation, but the actual wording. And then we come to the actual point of governance. Rule then over them by what God revealed. Rule then over them by what God revealed. So rule over them using the principles within this divine code. Do not pander to their emotions, aimed at making you swerve from what is real. Now that's a very powerful line. We should disregard emotions. In other words, public opinion. In other words, the powerful narrative influenced by the passions and the emotions of the masses. فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ عَمَّا جَاءَكَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ. عَمَّا جَاءَكَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ. Now the word haq there, we can read as reality, because in Arabic the word haq stands for reality and for truth. So what it says here is, rule over them by what God has revealed. Do not pander. لا تتبع أهواهم. Do not pander to their emotions, aimed at making you swerve from what is real. For each community, the next important point, for each community, for each of your communities formed by us, there are peculiar laws and a peculiar means of functioning. This is a powerful statement once again. Another powerful statement. For each of your communities formed by us, there are peculiar laws and a peculiar means of functioning. لِكُلِّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. That's exactly what it says there. A peculiar law and a peculiar means of functioning. We'll come to the meaning of this just in a few seconds. If God so wished, He could make you all one nation, but instead He offers you a contest using your group's resources. Compete then to gain more good. The destiny for all of you is God, and He shall one day point out to you about matters you disputed over. Summary quickly is that this verse explains or lays out quite a few core principles of governance, of good governance. Number one, it is pluralistic. Number two, it is grounded in the Testament, in the divine principles. Number three, it is not a rule of emotions or public opinion, but it is based on what is real and what is true. In other words, it is based on sound research and on reality. So, and then, I mentioned that it is pluralistic, and it creates an opportunity for excelling because there is no uniformity, because it is not a monolithic, it does not take a monolithic vision of society, but a pluralistic vision of society. It allows for mutual competition towards acquiring good. Let us just look at the next verse then. Next verse says, verse 49. وَأَنْ يَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ وَاحْذَرْهُمْ أَنْ يَفْتِنُوكَ عَنْ بَعْضِ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ. This verse expands the idea of governance now. It looks at, so let's just quickly do the translation first. The command is for you to rule over them by what God revealed and not to pander to their emotions. Again, the good governance is not based on the emotions and on public opinion, but on what is real and what is just. And then, so that point is made again for a second time in verse 49. The good governance is not based on wishy-washy public opinion and emotions. And then the next point it makes, it goes into a new point. Be warned also that they will challenge you on elements of the revelation to you from God. So those core principles that you will incorporate in your governance, they will challenge you on some of those principles. And today it's very clear that many people who observe or have seen governance based on the divine or based on eternal principles, they question it. They question it because they judge it in reference to their own emotions and in reference to their own shallow understanding. But it does allow for such challenge. You see, now that is important here, is that the Quran allows for that challenge. Be warned that they will challenge you on elements of the revelation to you from God. Right? So the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam is warned here that, listen, these people are going to challenge some of the things that this code contains. Let's say, for example, some of the elements of the penal code, they might challenge it. But should they then abstain from observing such elements, be aware that God has willed painful consequences on them for their dereliction. So in certain elements of the divine code, right, the divine code, people may opt out. People may opt to abstain from observing those elements. But then the Qur'an, the text clarifies, وَإِن تَوَلَّوْا فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ أَن يُصِيبَهُم بِبَعْضِ ذُنُوبِهِمْ. That should they commit such dereliction, be aware that God has willed painful consequences on them for their dereliction. So people are free to adopt the law, the rules, the divine principles, or they are free to reject it. But what they should know is that when they reject the divine principles, the sublime principles, the transcendent principles, then they will pay a price in terms of consequences. Right? Consequences will follow. It is so that the majority of people will commit some dereliction in their observance. The reality is stated there that people will never ever be 100%. This also dispels the fictitious idea of the Khawarij. You know, an early sect of Islam that believed that the sinner is outside of the fold. This verse, and in terms of Zaydi and Mu'tazila reasoning, this verse spells out the station of the fasiq, which is not a kafir. You see, kathir min an-nas fasiq. Most people are derelict in some way or another. So the Mu'tazila sect or the Zaydiyah, they make room for such human weakness and frailty and call such acts of dereliction, in other words, fisq. And the Quran here clarifies that people will be allowed a certain latitude in terms of committing such dereliction, but they themselves will experience the consequences. So if you, for example, where the code says, Kulu washrabu wala tusrifu, you know, where the code says, do eat and do drink, but commit not excess. So when we commit such excess, when we overeat and we overdrink, then we are afflicted with poor health. And that is the consequences of our dereliction. You understand? So the Quran spells it out that, yes, you are free to go slack on some of the law or some of the divine code, but do keep in mind that you will be visited by the consequences of such dereliction. And then the last verse in this set of series of 3 verses goes as follows. Fahkum. It says, أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ يَبْغُونَ أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ يَبْغُونَ وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حُكْمًا لِقَوْمِ يُوقِنُونَ. Do they then desire the rule of ignorance when it comes to rulership for a people convicted to God? Who then can outshine God? And so that nicely closes that set of 3 verses. In fact, I left out a few verses that preceded verse 47. Maybe I should just quickly take you to verse 40. The long one is 40. Yeah, 41, I think. Yeah. Let me just quickly take you to this. I'm not going to go through the whole one here. But this one, it speaks about those who are not fully in the camp of the Prophet, right? And it says, heed this, dear messenger, never in despair. Sorry. Actually, no, it's the next one. Those who happily entertain lies and then swallow the deception. There are those people who are prey to the deceptions of the evil forces, right? The powerful elite, those who would wish mankind, to be enslaved and to be subdued to their wishes. So this verse here, 42, says, those who happily entertain lies and then swallow the deception of the forces of evil. Should these types approach you, you may choose to govern over them or to avoid them. They constitute no threat to you, even if you choose to avoid them. Should you choose to govern over them, however, do so with justice, for God's love is for the just. Quickly, let's go to some lessons that I would like to draw out of the verses that you've just seen, and just move that right. So, lesson number 1: good governance is anchored in the divine, the transcendent, or the eternal. You see, if we make the assumption that our efforts at governance is only aimed at pleasing the living or the electorate, then we have compromised the unborn. We have compromised the dead. We have compromised the weak in society. Are you with me? When the only consideration for the system of governance, or for those who rule, when the only consideration is the electorate, they will abandon the rights of the unborn, the rights of the dead, and the rights of those who are weak. And so we cannot anchor our rule in the electorate. We cannot anchor the principles of good governance in the electorate, in those who are eligible to go and vote. Because our principles transcend the interests and the rights of the electorate. And that is why the rule of the divine, is a rule that is anchored in divine principles. And those divine principles are mentioned in the code. The rights of the weak in society, the rights of the respect to nature, respect to the earth, to the environment, respect to those who are weak and downtrodden and oppressed, respect to those who are enslaved. So the divine rule, is a rule that is broad-based in truth and not just in the interests of the electorate. Point number 2, the divine transcendent principles became immutable with the advent of the final testament. From what I've shown you there in that verse 48, chapter 5, was that divine rule was introduced to humanity at various points in its history, via the Torah, via the gospel, and via other forms of scripture and relays from the divine via the prophets and the messengers. But what the Qur'an promises here is that in the final testament, the wording of the code has become immutable. And so the Qur'an, or the final testament, remains now the ultimate control over what is legal and illegal. Next point, divinely rooted governance is pluralistic in as far as the peculiarities of each community is concerned. And that we get here in verse 49. In verse 49 it says, for each community formed by us, there are peculiar laws and a peculiar means of functioning. So the point that is made there is that the governance that is rooted in the divine is indeed pluralistic, in the sense that it takes the unique conditions, context, circumstances, and the unique resources of any community, of any society. It keeps that in mind, and it allows for that society to evolve its own legal systems and its own unique ways of conducting their legal system and managing it, right? Which is to be separated from the core divine principles which the Qur'an conveys, right? So we must draw a distinction between the law, the Sharia, right? Shir', which is a particular expression of the core principles of God, the Kitab. The Kitab can be expressed in various incarnations and in pertaining to the uniqueness of each society. So the idea of a Sharia, a global Sharia, is at loggerheads with the Quran. The idea of a Sharia that is created by one sultan or one mullah for all of humanity is at odds with the Quran. The Quran makes room in this verse 48 for different ways of expressing the divine core principles. And those divine core principles are not laws, they are the core principles of any governance. Divinely rooted governance is optional. That's another important point there. Right? So divine principles are optional. Because as I read to you there, that there are those, in verse 44 I showed you, that the Prophet is instructed that you may govern over them or you may allow them to govern themselves. So this governance by divine principle is an optional choice for societies. Ignoring divine transcendent principles within governance amounts to oppression. And I actually never got to those verses. Those verses also preceded, and I'm going to look at those beautiful verses. It says here in verse 47, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. Those who fail to govern by what God revealed are oppressors. And in the very next verse, those who fail, the very previous verse, actually verse 44, those who fail, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. And so that one says it in those who fail to rule by what God revealed are enemies of truth. So I rest my case at this point, and I'll leave you with these principles. Ignoring divine principles will result in oppression. Ignoring divine principles will result in a denial of truth or reality. And so these are really the core principles of good governance, which the Quran lays out. And if we look at our world today, the way we are experiencing corruption in governance, we can really say that the Quran's vision of divinely rooted governance is offered as an option, although it states here that people who refuse to accept it will suffer the consequences, but they are free to do so. It speaks about consequences in the form of the results of your own poor judgment. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.